In a world that often rushes romance into declarations, performances, and labels, mature lesbian love blooms in quieter spaces beyond words. It is not simply about passion or chemistry, though both may exist. It is about presence. It is about mutual understanding shaped by years of lived experience, emotional self-awareness, and the courage to be fully seen without needing to explain. Mature love between women is often rooted in shared resilience. It may carry the weight of past heartbreaks, of societal erasure, or of long periods spent hiding. But those very experiences become the soil in which deeper connection grows, where glances speak volumes, silences are comfortable, and love is shown in gestures of care, empathy, and unwavering loyalty. Trust is not assumed but built patiently. Boundaries are respected as sacred, not negotiable. And rather than idealize one another, women in mature lesbian relationships recognize and embrace complexity. There's space for contradiction, for change, for being human. But what sustains this kind of love isn't grand declarations. It's the hand that reaches without asking, the deep listening, the consistency, the laughter that comes from knowing someone so well it feels like coming home, and the quiet knowledge that this love does not need to be performed, it only needs to be lived. Elaine sat by the window, the morning light warming her forearms as she cradled a cup of black tea. It was strong, unsweetened like most things in her life. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and cedar from the old diffuser tucked behind a bookcase. Her eyes didn't scan the pages of the novel in her lap. Instead, they drifted toward the garden outside, where ivy twisted around the porch railing like time reclaiming its own rhythm. Across the room, Ruth was humming as she folded laundry. A soft jazz melody played low on the record player, and the slow brushing of cotton against itself became a kind of background percussion. They had lived in this house for 9 years, but their stories stretched further than the walls could hold. Two women who had arrived in each other's lives not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle, after the marriages, after the heartbreaks, after the truths long buried had been exhumed. They were both in their 50s when they met. Ruth, a community college counselor, had raised 2 sons with a man she respected but never fully loved. Elaine, a retired dance instructor, had spent years alone, partly by choice, partly out of fear. Coming out hadn't been an event. It had been a series of silent acknowledgments, whispered more to herself than to anyone else. Until Ruth thought they met at a book reading. Not the kind of place where sparks usually fly, but then again, theirs wasn't a story of sparks. It was more like embers, quiet, glowing, persistent. The connection wasn't immediate in the Hollywood sense. There was no swoon, no whirlwind. There was only conversation. Thoughtful, funny, vulnerable conversation that flowed like a creek rather than a flood. They talked about loss of youth, of illusions, of people. They talked about reinvention and the discomfort of freedom. Ruth had just left her job to start a grief support group. Elaine had recently survived a breast cancer scare. Life had stripped them both of their protective shells, and oddly enough, that nakedness became the ground they stood on together. When they first began dating, both had agreed explicitly that there would be no games. They didn't have the time or energy for ambiguity. Their flirtations were small but meaningful, a hand resting longer on the table, eyes that lingered, texts that said thinking of you without needing to say more. Neither tried to impress the other with illusion. And as they grew closer, they both came to appreciate something neither had fully experienced before: the peace of being with someone who wasn't trying to fix you, change you, or define you. They didn't speak of love immediately. It wasn't necessary. Love bloomed in gestures, not declarations. Elaine remembered the morning Ruth showed up unannounced with her favorite soup when she had a cold. Ruth never forgot how Elaine once sat with her in silence for hours after a panic attack, not offering advice, just presence. They lived in separate homes for the first 2 years, seeing each other every weekend, then more often, until it simply made sense to move in together. Even that was decided not with fanfare, but with a quiet question over breakfast. Would you mind waking up next to me every day? Now, at 64 and 61, they shared a rhythm. Not perfection ever, but rhythm. Ruth still left half-finished coffee cups everywhere. Elaine still got restless during Ruth's beloved nature documentaries. But they met each other's annoyances with humor, not resentment. That, perhaps, was the clearest mark of their maturity. The ability to hold contradiction with grace. The world around them still asked questions, sometimes out loud, sometimes in glances. They weren't the couple who posted selfies with matching hashtags, or went viral for kissing on a mountaintop, their love wasn't for show. It was for each other, and it was sacred. That morning, as Ruth placed a folded sweater on the armchair and crossed the room toward Elaine, she leaned down and pressed her lips to Elaine's silvering hair. "You're somewhere else this morning." Elaine smiled faintly. "Just thinking how lucky I am that we met in the middle." Ruth grinned. Middle's the best place to begin. There were a few things Ruth enjoyed more than cooking with Elaine on Sunday evenings. Not because the food was extraordinary, though. Elaine's roasted eggplant with tahini could convert a carnivore, but because of the way they moved around each other in the kitchen. It was choreography without rehearsal. Elaine reached for the olive oil just as Ruth passed her the knife. They spoke little, but the silence was full. Words weren't always necessary. They'd learned that over time. In younger years, both women had leaned heavily on language, Ruth with her earnest desire to explain everything she felt, and Elaine trying to control what she couldn't name. But time, age, and the steadiness of their bond had reshaped the way they communicated. Now, it was in the brushing of shoulders, the soft sighs, the weight of a hand on a hip while passing in the hallway. An entire conversation could be held. Through the eyes, a glance that said, "I see you. I know what you're thinking. I'm here." The first time Ruth realized this shift, they had just come home from the hospital. Elaine's mammogram had shown another shadow. It turned out to be benign. But the waiting those 3 days between scan and results had pulled Ruth into an old fear that loving deeply meant risking deeply, and that no matter how mature you were, grief could still gut you like a thief. That night, Ruth didn't know how to talk about it. Instead, she found herself sitting beside Elaine on the couch, holding her hand without looking at her. Elaine didn't speak either. Her thumb moved slowly over Ruth's knuckles, again and again. In that rhythm, Ruth heard the words she needed. "I'm here. I'm not afraid. You can fall apart if you need to." They often joked that theirs was a relationship of two introverts who finally found someone they didn't need to perform for. Ruth didn't need to narrate her anxiety. Elaine didn't need to justify her solitude. They had become fluent in each other's silences. Of course, there were moments when words were needed, like when Ruth's son came to visit and Elaine had to navigate the complicated terrain of being the woman in Mom's life, or when Elaine received a letter from her estranged sister apologizing for the years of silence after Elaine came out. In those moments, they returned to words, but words as tools, not shields. "I don't know how to respond," Elaine had whispered, holding the letter like it might catch fire in her hands. "You don't have to," Ruth had replied. "You get to choose how much space she takes in your piece." Elaine had cried then, not from pain, but relief. That was another gift of mature love, the ability to let go of performing forgiveness or strength, and instead simply be where you are. Their unspoken language extended to intimacy as well. No pressure, no obligation, just awareness. A slow touch on the back while brushing teeth, a kiss on the wrist while folding towels. These gestures, accumulated over days and years, formed a mosaic of connection that no passionate weekend fling could ever replicate. And yet, it wasn't all seamless. They disagreed on politics, on what counted as a clean kitchen, on whether dogs or cats were better companions. But they fought differently now. No yelling, no ultimatums. They had learned the rare art of pausing. "I need a minute," Ruth would say. When she felt her chest tighten with frustration, Elaine would nod. "I'll be on the porch. Come find me when you're ready." No door slams, no walking away in cold silence. Just space, held open with trust. In many ways, their love was like the garden they tended together. No longer wild like youth, but no less alive. It grew slowly, with intention, and always responded to care. That evening, as they ate together in the dim kitchen light, Ruth reached across the table and ran her thumb gently over a smear of eggplant on Elaine's cheek. "You have sauce here," she smiled. Elaine grinned. "You always find a way to touch me. Only because you always let me." And in that moment, no other words were needed. The rain had been falling since early morning, turning the world outside their windows into a watercolor blur. Ruth always said rainy days made her feel nostalgic, like someone had hit a soft rewind button on her memories. That morning was no exception. She sat by the fireplace, her legs tucked beneath her, flipping through a photo album that hadn't seen daylight in years. Elaine, wrapped in her favorite gray cardigan, noticed the shift in the air as soon as she entered the room. Ruth's posture was still, but her energy buzzed with something unsaid. Elaine sat beside her without a word, leaning close enough to read the captions scrawled under each photo. One page in particular held Ruth's attention: an old beach vacation with her ex-husband and sons. taken when she was still trying to believe that a life with a man could satisfy her. I used to smile like I was being watched, Ruth murmured. Elaine didn't interrupt. It wasn't fake, she added, just filtered, edited. I was trying to be the kind of happy I thought everyone expected me to be. Elaine placed a hand on Ruth's thigh, grounding her. You don't smile like that with me, Elaine said quietly. No, I don't. Ruth leaned her head on Elaine's shoulder. With you, I forget to smile. And then I realize I'm already doing it. They stayed like that for a while, flipping through Ruth's memories together, not erasing them, not rewriting them, but making room beside them. This was part of what made mature love so profound. The understanding that the past doesn't vanish when new love begins. It coexists, it breathes beside you. Elaine had her own memories. She had loved before, fiercely and unreciprocated. She had fallen for a woman during her early 30s, an affair filled with longing and secrecy. That woman had chosen safety over love, returning to a life that made sense on paper but left Elaine with a quiet fracture inside. For years, she believed that was the closest she'd come to real love. Until Ruth. I think I grieved her for so long, I stopped noticing the weight, Elaine once confessed. And now? Ruth asked. Elaine smiled. Now, I don't carry it. You do something strange to time. You make the past feel respected, but no longer defining. It was one of the few times Ruth cried in front of her, not out of sadness, but from being understood on such a granular level. They often spoke about how love changes with age. Not diminishes, changes, it slows down, deepens. It becomes less about proving something and more about creating space to be something. Neither of them needed the other to fill a void. They were two whole people, choosing to share a life to complete one another, but to expand what already existed that day. As the rain continued, they decided to start a new photo album, not just with pictures, but with written memories. Quotes they'd exchanged, meals they cooked, places they visited, times they cried, the moments in between, the quiet Sundays, the soft apologies, the unexpected laughter in a hardware store. Elaine wrote the first entry. Today we didn't escape the past, we invited it in, gave it tea, and told it we're okay now, Ruth added. And then we turned the page. There was no urgency to complete the book. It would grow at its own pace like them. Later that evening, Elaine stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in RIVULETS. Ruth came up behind her and wrapped her arms around her waist. Do you ever wish we'd met earlier? Ruth whispered. Elaine turned to face her, touching her cheek. If we had, she said, we might have met too soon to recognize each other. Ruth kissed her, not for passion, but for presence. For all the time that came before, and all the time that still stretched ahead. The day Elaine received the call about her heart, everything shifted. It wasn't a dramatic emergency, no sirens, no collapse. Just a firm, clinical voice on the phone informing her that her latest tests revealed arrhythmia significant enough to require intervention, a procedure, a monitor, a possibility that her body might not move the way it once did. Elaine was quiet on the drive home. Ruth noticed the stiffness in her posture, the way she avoided turning up the radio, how her hands gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly. But she didn't ask anything, not yet. Ruth knew that some things needed to land fully before they could be named. Later that evening, Elaine finally sat down on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat. I'm scared, she whispered. It was the first time Ruth had ever heard her say those words. Not in that way. Elaine had always been strong, not in the performative, invincible kind of way, but in the practical, composed sense. She was the one who always made the calls, filled out the forms, held space for Ruth's anxiety when it flared like an old injury. But this was different. Ruth didn't rush in with assurances. Instead, she sat on the floor in front of Elaine and gently took off her shoes, one at a time, slowly, reverently. I've got you, she said. You don't have to be brave for me. Elaine's chin trembled. I don't know how to let you hold this. Ruth looked up. Then let's carry it together. And so they did. In the weeks that followed, vulnerability became a daily act, not just spoken, but lived. Ruth learned how to ask questions without pushing. Elaine learned how to answer without feeling like she was burdening someone. Their routines shifted. Ruth began joining Elaine on her morning walks to track her pulse. Elaine, once fiercely independent, allowed herself to lean on Ruth without apology. They learned new ways of touching, softer, slower, more intentional. Not just romantically, but practically. Ruth would massage Elaine's arms when circulation felt poor. Elaine would rest her head on Ruth's lap when she was too dizzy to stand. These quiet rituals weren't signs of weakness. They were the most intimate declarations of trust. One night, as they lay in bed, Elaine murmured, "You know, when I was younger, I thought love was about hiding the ugliest parts of yourself, so you wouldn't lose the person." Ruth traced small circles on her forearm. "And now," she asked. Elaine exhaled. "Now I know love is where you bring those parts, so you don't have to hold them alone." It wasn't just Elaine who was changing. Ruth, too, found herself softening in ways she hadn't anticipated. She let down walls she didn't know she still had. She cried during quiet documentaries. She started painting again. She asked for help when her migraines returned, something she had never done, not even during her marriage. Their relationship became a living example of something they had once only read about: interdependence. Not codependence, not rugged individualism, but a balance of strength and tenderness. A shared promise that said, "I will not rescue you, I will not carry all your pain, but I will never leave you alone in it." Their friends noticed. One evening, during a dinner with a couple from their hiking group, someone said, "You too. It's like you talk without talking." Elaine smiled. "We've just been practicing a long time." That night, Ruth added something to their shared memory album. "Today, we learned that letting someone see your fear isn't weakness. It's the most courageous kind of intimacy." Elaine added beneath it, "and to be held without fixing. Love does that." The next morning, they stood in the kitchen in silence as the coffee brewed. Ruth placed her hands on Elaine's waist, leaned her forehead against her back, and whispered, "Still scared?" Elaine smiled, eyes closed. "Yes." Ruth kissed her shoulder. "Then let's keep being scared together." It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Elaine turned to Ruth and said, "I think I finally understand the difference between being loved and being seen." They were sitting beneath their favorite tree in the park just beyond the neighborhood, the one with the bark like cracked leather and the branches that swayed like they were dancing for no one. They had brought a small picnic: hummus, olives, figs, and too much cheese. Their knees touched under the blanket. The sun filtered through the leaves in slow, golden movements. Ruth looked at her, not startled by the statement, but intrigued. "Tell me," she said. Elaine picked at the corner of a fig. Being loved was always something that came with expectations. People loved the dancer, the strong one, the caretaker. They loved the parts of me that served a purpose. But they didn't always see me. The tiredness, the questions, the parts that weren't performing. Ruth didn't speak. She just nodded, knowing. Elaine smiled. "You saw me before I knew I was worth being seen." It wasn't said dramatically. It was spoken like a fact that had long waited for its place. That was what defined this stage of their love. Not declarations, not intensity, but clarity, simplicity, presence. They were approaching their 10th year together. The house bore the quiet marks of a life shared: a dent in the hallway from when Ruth tripped while carrying groceries, a tiny crack in the window from the winter they tried to insulate the old frames themselves, a stack of notes and receipts, and love letters tucked in a kitchen drawer that neither of them planned to organize. They had weathered health scares, holidays with complicated family dynamics, and the sharp sting of losing old friends. Some had passed, some had simply faded. But through it all, they remained soft but unshaken. Elaine once described their relationship as a room where nothing needed to be hidden. "I can walk in messy," she said, "and you'll just pull up a chair and ask if I want tea." Ruth had responded, "You've done the same for me more times than I can count." Their days were filled with ordinary beauty: grocery lists, slow walks, reruns of cooking shows, the smell of lavender on freshly washed sheets, and none of it felt small. None of it felt like settling. If anything, they had grown into this pace, like a song finally played at the right tempo. One night, during a rare bout of insomnia, Ruth sat up in bed and whispered, "Do you ever miss the fire?" Elaine stirred beside her, blinking awake. "You mean the chaos? The chasing? The highs and lows?" Ruth nodded. Elaine pulled her close, pressing her lips to Ruth's temple. "I don't miss fire," she said. "I found the hearth. And that was the difference." Fire burns, hearth warms. They had arrived at a kind of love that didn't need to chase, prove, or fix. It simply held, like hands in the dark, like breath in sync, like language without speaking. A few weeks later, they renewed their wills, assigning one another as medical proxies. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but when Ruth signed the papers, Elaine looked at her with tears in her eyes. "This is what forever really looks like," she said. "Not vows in front of a crowd, but this: choosing each other again and again and again when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And Ruth, who had spent so many years feeling like she needed to explain her love to the world, finally realized she didn't need to. Not anymore, because some love isn't loud, it doesn't need a spotlight. Some love just stays. In a world that often confuses noise with connection, mature lesbian love reminds us that the deepest bonds are built in silence, resilience, and unwavering presence. Love that doesn't need to shout because it's already home. Gives if this story touched you, share it with someone who understands love beyond words.